Hi, Misha here, and late last year I did a video comparing two rifles that I thought really needed comparing. The original AK-47, the milled version, often compared to the M16, but I thought in that video it was more appropriate to compare it to the M14 in the USA. They're very much contemporaries, along with the AKM. Why not? Yeah. In that video I kind of mentioned another comparison I'd want to do eventually, and try to think about what to do today. It seemed like the right time because I really felt like getting out a couple of my favorite rifles. Let's address the age-old question: FN FAL or HK G3, both chambered for 7.62 by 51 millimeter, 7.62 NATO. Both in service around the same time, both produced by roughly 18 nations, both made in the millions, very close together in the numbers. But of course there are many differences as well. Some of this video will be just facts about these guns from their development and mechanical function, and parts will be just my feelings and experiences shooting them and why I do prefer one over the other. And for the main part of this video, I'll be kind of using these four rifles as example pieces. Up here to represent early versions of the FAL, we have my British BSA L1A1 semi-auto. Then we have the Mars imported Spanish CETME semi-auto. Yeah, it's a CETME, but the original G3s were very close to the CETMEs here, so it'll work. And then I thought we could look at some of the compact models. So we have my Argentinian paratrooper here, known as the Model 5063 with the folding stock. And finally, my Springfield imported SAR-38 with the HK pattern A4 type collapsing stock. So yeah, we'll see how the original rifles compare and then how the somewhat newer carbine versions here compare and all that. So hope you hang with me. Please, if you could, do like, share, subscribe, and I really like to talk in the comments and discuss things. I'd like to hear your own opinion. And before we get started, there's a link to the Patreon page in the description if you'd like to help support the channel. But if you can't, no problem at all. But please at least do click like, because YouTube. So, let's get into it. I promise we won't dwell too long on the history today for this video because I really want to talk about just the use of the guns and the mechanics. But just for context, I brought out the SAFN, also known as the FN-49, because this is where the FAL, and thus the L1A1, started from. And of course we have Dieu le Nave Saïf to thank for this gun. Now, Saïf was working on a self-loading or even select fire gun before and during when he was in Britain in exile in World War II. And they got the idea they needed an intermediate cartridge. So as early as 1946, he would use his system and chamber it for the 7.92 by 33 8mm Kurz cartridge used in the MP44, Sturmgewehr 44, because it was really the only tried and tested intermediate cartridge available in the West in numbers at the time. So the earliest prototypes for the FAL would be in that caliber, and of course that would get us to the FN-49. Now the FN-49 is a full power rifle, firing 30-06, 8mm, and it was put into production to kind of get some money going for FN after the occupation, and also to work on some concepts. It uses almost an identical gas plug as our L1A1, and it has an extremely similar looking front sight and a very similar gas piston system, short stroke. That continues with the tilting or tipping bolt in both that locks in the rear. Now the FN-49's recoil system is all in its receiver here, not in the stock. In the FAL, it would get moved to the stock, but it actually would go back to the receiver, which we'll talk about in a bit. It had a fixed 10-round mag. They, of course, knew about detaching mags, but there's various reasons why, and even some of the truer components can be similar enough. So the guts are very much there at the FN-49, and it allowed them to get this ready. So, first prototype of the FAL was in 8mm Kurz. The British were among the earliest to really take note. In 1948, they looked at some concepts that SAF had, as well as prototypes, and they said, we've got this new cartridge. It was basically a 7mm, a 280 British round, intermediate. They thought this FAL thing, which light rifle in French, would be perfect, and they weren't wrong. So FN would rework the gun for the British round, and the British would try it out, and then in 1950, 1951, the Americans would look at the FAL prototype in 280 British. And the Americans said, hey, we like the gun, but we've got this new cartridge, 30 light rifle. So in 1951, FN had a decision. Should we go with 280 British or 30 light American? Today, the outcome is quite famous and even infamous, but in 1950-51, the answer was not clear to FN. Things were a-changin'. The U.S. was really looking to be the better horse to back. Britain had a Labour government in, and they actually not only adopted the 280 round, but were seemingly going away from the FAL, going with their own M2 design. In fact, the M2 was adopted as the rifle number 9, briefly. So, because of this, FN, moving forward, worked their gun for 30 light rifle. Figuring America would purchase it, figuring Britain was a lost cause. The goal was to basically win over NATO countries. The idea was already cooking because of the Korean War and just the conflicts with the East to have a standard cartridge and a standard rifle for NATO. In fact, there was the Allied Rifle Commission, or Steering Committee, set up expressly to pick a rifle and a cartridge to be standard amongst NATO. But in late 1951, during a general election, there was an upset in the UK. Labour was out, and Churchill was back in. So the decision to adopt the M2 and the 280 cartridge was quickly reversed. Now Britain's on board for the FAL, and it's a de facto decision already that 30 light rifle would be adopted. In fact, in 1954, the Commission would select the American 30 light rifle cartridge to be a NATO standard. Thus how we ended up with 7.62 NATO, 7.62 by 51. However, the committee, never selected a standard rifle. This is why we have the M14, the BM59, the L1A1, and even the MAS 4956, because the French, they gotta be different. The FN-49 here proved itself during the Korean War. This is an Egyptian model though, but also proved that a full power cartridge was less than plus a 10-round mag. Now the 30 light rifle, the 7.62 NATO cartridge, really was just a modernized 30-06. It was a half-inch shorter, a little bit lighter, but it was pretty punchy. It also required that the FAL get stretched out a bit. You can really see it in the mag well here. This area, if you think about it, seems a little stretched, and maybe even the barrel a bit. So if you think about how this would have looked with a 33 or 40 millimeter cartridge versus 51, yeah, you're about a half-inch shorter here. Kind of makes sense. Now, the Commonwealth, we'll say, Britain, Australia, Canada was actually very interested in the FAL, and Canada kind of led the way in studies, as did the Steering Commission. They proposed several improvements and changes, and most of those are integrated into the L1A1 here, including it being semi-automatic only, hence SLR, self-loading rifle, a large change lever, the folding sights, just all the the grip with the folding trigger guard. Yeah, a lot of this is actually early, even before a lot of the metrics. If you want to see an early metric, look at an Israeli pattern. They have a lot of early so-called metric features, but they were pretty concurrent. This is how, in 1953-54, the Commonwealth would adopt this gun, the C1 and then the L1A1, and so on and so forth. Then it would come in chambered for the 7.62 NATO round after consideration, and spread amongst all these nations. But I guess started taking its bolt carrier and gas system from SAF's original design here. So, what of our CETME G3? As for the CETME G3, it's a very interesting story dating back to World War II, and gives me another excuse to bring the MP44 out, because of course this was a pioneering gun, considered the first assault rifle as such, literal definition, 16-inch barrel firing the 7.92 millimeter curves, what we just talked about, fixed stock. And really none of the mechanics of this are important. This is a long stroke piston with a tilting tipping bolt, and the recoil spring is a giant style in the stalker. However, aside from the intermediate cartridge concept, which is important, the construction methods are very critical here. The stamped and welded with the machined trunnion, and the takedown method with the push pin removing the stock, and even a lower frame that hinges down. The overall construction is obviously very reminiscent of the CETME. 2 pins here instead of 1, still a hinged down housing. And you can see the shape of the receiver is even quite there. Even the placement of things like the selector switch are not far off. Even the handguards. This has like basically clip-on metal handguard with a gas tube. This has a screw-on wood, later with the G3, a push pin. And yeah, of course the front sight system is a little different, but threaded barrel. I think you can see the thing there. Now, of course, the MP44 used a gas system. At the end of the war, they were hoping to do away with that, going to the roller delay system with the Sturmgewehr model of 1945 Mauser, or just STG-45M, still firing 8mm curves. It would use a roller blowback system, essentially taken from the MG42, but doing away with the MG42's moving barrel. Interesting system, but they only built a few guns, 200 maybe total, probably not even 100 actually assembled. But one of its creators at Mauser, Ludwig Vorgrimler, would survive the war, mess around in France for a bit, work on guns for a bit, and then find himself in Spain. Vorgrimler would find himself working at CETME, a state development arsenal, and really would go with the roller system. And the earliest concept guns, or earliest prototypes, were also chambered for 7.92 by 33 Kerrs. Then they had the idea to do a new cartridge, 7.92 by 41 millimeter CETME. So an extended, version, still intermediate, but a little more oomph behind it. Makes sense. 33 is a little stubby. And this was well received in 1953-54. In fact, the Spanish military would get a few test models, sometimes called the CETME Model A, although this is a little early to really be an A, but early development guns. And also the German border guard, the BGS, was interested. And it was actually the BGS that would push things further. Seeing how NATO was going, they wanted the same 41 millimeter cartridge, but they wanted a .30 caliber bullet, 7.62. So CETME would combine, coming up with 7.62 by 41 CETME. A very thin, long thing that actually performed really well in 1954-55 during testing. The only problem by the time they had it ready, what the BGS wanted, now the BGS didn't want it anymore because fickle. Okay, the truth is because NATO had selected a standard cartridge, 7.62 by 51 millimeter. So now the BGS comes back in 1955, give or take, saying we need this new gun chambered for that. So CETME goes back, shortens it, or excuse me, stretches it out a bit, but they use a less of a powder charge and a lighter bullet. Part of it is just to keep recoil manageable if on select fire. Part of it is because they're still developing the math and the metallurgy for the roller lock system. So this ends up with 7.62 by 51 CETME, and this is the Model A. So, ready to go, 1956. Now the BGS doesn't want it at all. They end up actually adopting this. Okay, not exactly this, but close. In 1955, they had a little over 100 FALs, what they called the Improved Canada models, sent to them. And in 1956, they upped the order, having up to about 30,000, and they would change over time, evolving into this. The early versions had wood handguards. They would go to metal with the bipod. Now, the BGS guns would typically have the tall sights, although late orders could have the 3mm shorter sights. And the early ones had no muzzle device. Later, they had the Type B. This has the QD style of the G1. With still having the metal handle. The early ones would have wood grips, pistol grips, blah, blah, blah. Wood stocks. The BGS went with the FAL. However, the Bundeswehr, who was very young at this time, just allowed to form, they were interested in the CETME. In fact, they had a trial series sent over at the end of 1956, and they worked with it, and they got a very young company involved, Heckler & Koch. They worked with CETME to improve the gun, coming up with what will be known as the Model B in 1957. And that's what this is directly based on here. They would have a little bit better ergonomics, they would improve the metallurgy, and the Model B was the first that was strong enough to fire 7.62 NATO proper. However, it was still chambered for 7.62 CETME for the time being. The Model B would be adopted by Spain at the end of 1957 as the Model 1958. And it really caught the eye of the Bundeswehr. Now, the Bundeswehr did receive a large number of Gewehr 1s, G1s in 1957 and through 1958 from FN, but these were all built in Belgium. They needed to rearm because of tensions with the Russians, but they wanted to make their rifles in-house, and of course that was not something FN was keen on. And to be fair, Germany knew this. West Germany knew this. The Bundeswehr did this. It's kind of a bit of a dishonest argument one way or the other because they were already working with CETME to make a gun for them. It came as no surprise at the beginning of 1959 when West Germany's Bundeswehr adopted the Model B as the Gewehr 3. It even rhymes. So from 1960 onward, the G1 was phased out in favor of the G3, not so much because the G1 was a bad gun, but for more logistical, political reasons. But it is interesting to note that West Germany is one of the few nations, there are others, but it's one of the few that actively used both guns in large numbers. They had about 100,000 G1s, and of course, a much larger number of G3s even than that. This would, production would ramp up throughout the 1960s, both in Spain and Germany, and the design was finally off to the races, and thanks to cooperation between HK and CETME, it was really ready for prime time after flip-flopping around on cartridges, kind of figuring out where its place was. So with that, let's get to comparing. with a bit of history and development out of the way, let's look at the production models, at least for the early ones, and compare features, specifications, ergonomics, pros, cons, yada yada. Again, I picked the L1A1 because of its early adoption. And, of course, originally it would have had wood furniture, but it was replaced by this pebble grain stuff in the 60s, late 60s, 70s. And the original G3s were based on the same model 1958, the Model B, as the CETME here. These Mars were imported in the mid-60s, so they're kind of a cross between the B and the C, really. And, of course, as time would go on, they would evolve separately. So, feature-wise, really weight, about the same. Your FAL, your L1A1 is about 9.6 pounds. Your early roller gun here is a little more at about 9.8, 9.9. Part of it is the heavy bolt system. Part of it is the wood furniture. Part of it is the magazine. These are pretty heavy mags. Originally, the CETME had a steel mag. The HK original G3 would continue. Slightly different curvature to it, but the curve in the Spanish version is a bit of a holdover from its original chamberings. The L1A1 uses the improved, at least according to the Allied Steering Committee for Rifles, version of the mag, still 20 rounds too. It has the enlarged floor plate and the larger lip in the front, which I would agree is an improvement. So both use 20 round mags, both pretty heavy duty. Now, overall length for the L1A1, thanks to the longer muzzle device, is about 45 inches, so definitely the longest one we have, although that's variable a bit because of the different length buttstocks and butt plates available to set it for the shooter. The CETME, on the other hand, is actually our shortest. It's just right at 40 inches with the standard stock and whatnot. The L1A1 has nearly a 22-inch barrel if you count the device, whereas the CETME has a barrel just under 18 inches. So a little bit shorter barrel on that. Kind of explains some things. They, of course, fire the same 7.62 NATO cartridge, and generally speaking are built to roughly the same standards because, military rifle. Simple, robust, durable, easy to maintain in the field. But there are plenty of differences. In fact, mechanically, they really couldn't be more differenter. The FAL, the L1A1, uses a short stroke gas piston with a multiple position regulator, typically 13, but you can dial it in. That piston will hit a carrier that takes a tilting or tipping bolt to lock and unlock the breech. It actually locks in the rear where our locking shoulder is. It has what they call a rat tail that connects in the back to a spring stored in the buttstock. And of course we have a machined receiver with a thin top cover here. Pistol grip, yeah. The CETME HK, totally different based on its origin. Nothing in the buttstock. It does attach, of course, to this end piece that has our recoil guide that goes all the way in. And that's where we get to our stamped receiver that's welded together. It's actually quite reminiscent of the technology used for the AK. And then we have quite an intricately machined front trunnion where our roller lock system, or at least roller delayed blowback, whichever you prefer, locks in. We have quite a massive bolt group. This tube on top is not a gas tube, it's just a cocking tube. There's no gas system, as you know. And we do have a removable lower frame here that's from the mag to here. The FAL has a lower frame too, but it's much more of a piece hinged in the middle. So, yeah. This, of course, is the receiver part here, and this is the receiver part here. Sights, originally, you had a 2-position, later a 4-position flip style in the CETME, and even the original versions of the HKG3 had a flip rear sight. In fact, the earliest guns had kind of a Mauser-style leaf sight further forward. And then, of course, we have a post inside a protected. This is the triple frame, and then here's our bayonet lug on our CETME style. Typical flash hider. This is the early style, of course. The FAL is a little different. We have an adjustable sight here. It's tall on the originals. On the L1A1, it can fold down, so it can be used with an optic very easily, and it just scoots forward. And then on pretty much all the early ones, we had a tall front sight with the open sides. I will say that for the sights on your CETME, this is welded to the receiver. This is very much fixed to the barrel. So assuming they're sighted in properly, very solidly mounted to the gun. For your FAL, our rear sight is part of the lower frame, and our front sight is part of the barrel, which is connected to the receiver. And of course, the upper and lower bits here are only connected by this hinge pin and the latch in the back. So there is potential for wiggle and drift more with these sights. So in theory, maybe a little less durable. Plus, again, this can move around and stuff. But in practicality, these are battle rifles. They're not designed to be DMRs. So you're looking anywhere from 2 to 3, maybe even up to 4 MOA, depending on the ammo type. Yeah, not really intended. And in the beginning, neither was, of course, standard issue with the scope. Although the British would very quickly start using the suit optic, the Trilux, which is a top cover that went on. Of course, later the HK style would have the clamp on top. These Mars imports have a proprietary rail system. It's not a Picatinny. Kind of looks like an early version of Weaver, but that wasn't on the military guns. So sighting, take it as you will. I think it's a personal preference thing. One thing that was pointed out to me, since I can't shoot for sights, the way this has a hump in the back, for some people wearing glasses or goggles, that can really smack the crap out of them based on how the recoil is. And that does kind of bring us to the point. The roller delay system without a gas can be harsher, although in my opinion on the CETME, thanks to the buffer in the back of the cap here, it's actually gentler than on a lot of other guns like say PTRs. The extra weight does kind of help to absorb the recoil as well. On the FAL, of course, we have our recoil system in our stock, but what really helps is this gas system. You can really dial it in to get just enough gas to cycle reliably, but not over gas. The downside is for a military, it's also something for conscripts to play with, and it's a little more complicated and fidgety. Of course, it also has a cutoff in the front here to take the gas completely off, or launch grenades, what have you, or disassembly. The CETME G3 is by necessity just simpler because we have less going on. It's more of a brute force thing. Of course, one could also argue that the old joke is that the AR-15 craps where it eats, and that the CETME G3 has explosive diarrhea where it eats because it all just blows back in. As I said earlier, the Model 58, the Model B, introduced fluting to the chamber as they moved from the lighter CETME rounds to the NATO rounds to kind of aid in extraction, but of course that meant there was more gas blowback than before. Whereas the FAL, the L1A1 is just a traditional locked breech gun. but they do have some different features too. Let's talk about the ergonomics. Both have a similar style of safety. Of course, on an L1A1 SLR, it's CMOT only. On military CETMEs and G3s, it was almost always select fire. Personally, I find the FAL safety just easier to engage and more of a positive click. This is a little duller. On the L1A1, it is enlarged, which I do like. Also, for the FAL, at least for the L1A1 and some FALs, this trigger guard can be folded into the pistol grip here for use in the winter, but on a CETME, whatnot, it's just welded down, although it is a pretty large guard. The mag catch on the L1A1 especially is enlarged and really could be hit either hand, but it's really designed for the offhand thumb, nice and big. On the CETME G3, you have the auxiliary catch on the semi-auto. On the full autos, you'd have a paddle here. Also probably quite easy to access, but I still kind of like the feel, again, especially of the L1A1. One feature that the FAL series has that the CETME G3 does not, a bolt hold open. There's nothing here. Here we have a lever. On the standard FAL, it's a last round hold open. For the L1A1, one of the decisions they made, at least for certain nations, was to take the nub off, so it's a manual hold open only. It doesn't hold open on the last round automatically, but again, that's easy if you would prefer it. So that's one feature I really do enjoy, and I think modern shooters would as well. Both do have non-reciprocating cocking. It folds on the CETME G3. On the L1A1, it folds as well, although on the original FAL it did not. That was one of the improvements they suggested. So non-reciprocating handles that fold on both of these. But because of the roller system and just how it's spaced, these can be difficult to unfold and charge because you're coming against a lot of mechanical force. It is much easier and more ergonomic because of how much further back it is to charge an FAL, in my opinion. Also, a carry handle is standard on an FAL, although you can remove it if you don't want it, but yeah, why not have it? Of course, their handguard covers the entire barrel and gas system, whereas on most CETMEs G3s, it's just this lower part here. So overall, I do like the ergonomics of the FAL a bit more, I have to be honest. Neither gun has a port door or port cover. And you can see on the L1A1 and some metrics as well, we have these sand cuts to try to keep the gun from clogging up. Something that the Israelis experienced during their use of the FAL, but other nations didn't. It just kind of depended on the combat. As far as disassembly for cleaning, you know, the FAL is quite easy. The lever's on the side, it hinges open, you pull your bolt out, your carrier, bolt and carrier. And for your gas system, you just remove this plug. There's a screw holding on the handguard. There is a screw holding on the buttstock. Do not remove it without the tool unless you like getting hit in the face with the spring. That's the one design thing I thought was a little odd, is just how the spring is housed in the stock. Not the fact that it is housed there, just, yeah. So a little ding for that. I do like that the headspace is set by the locking shoulder on the metric. That's all it is. For the inch pattern, there's also a washer between the receiver and the barrel to have the barrel timed properly. So those are the two elements for head spacing, or readjusting the headspace if necessary. On the CETME G3, disassembly is easier. Pop two pins out, remove your stock. Your lower housing on a full auto would hinge down. It has a pin too. On a semi, it's a little different. This one does have a pin, but in a different location because it was an early import. And then you just pull your bolt group out. So that part is quite simple. And you don't have a spring that wants to attack your face. The only problem here is because of the bolt head, the spring-loaded bolt head with the rollers. If it snaps on you, going in, locking in, there's a trick to getting it out, and that has befuddled people throughout time. So take it as you will. I would say that that's the biggest drawback to cleaning this, is just dealing with the bolt group itself. But otherwise, disassembly is quite easy. I should point out too that these pins are non-captive, so they could be lost, but at least they almost always give you holes in the stock to store them in. So if the soldier's halfway diligent, it's not too big of a deal. On the original HKs and on the CETMEs, the handguard's held on by a screw. Later it would go to a push pin on the HKs. And there's a small cleaning kit stored behind the bayonet lug. On some models of the FAL, but not the L1A1, there's also a small cleaning kit that can be stored in the pistol grip. So both can store a little thing on the front. Both have threaded barrels. Yeah. You know how it goes. So for cleaning and maintenance, I do slightly prefer the FAL L1A1. Disassembly could be a little easier on the CETME, but then again, you got to deal with the bolt. This is a stamped receiver with a machined trunnion. This is a entirely machined, forged receiver. FN would switch to castings, but that wouldn't happen until 1977, so quite late in production. Yeah, chrome line bores were just kind of coming into vogue, at least for some militaries. So for most all of your L1A1s, they'll be chromed. For some FALs, they would not be, and so on and so forth. So just pointing that out. I've often heard people call these elephant guns, mainly my friend Jerry. I still don't quite get it. For firing 7.62 NATO, neither one seems that big or heavy to me. They're under 10 pounds. And generally speaking, I find both fun and comfortable to shoot. But yeah, these both versions were introduced. This semi-auto is based on the model of 1958. The L1A1 here is based on the pattern first designed in 1954 and first put into production in service 57 and 59. So both were coming into use in the 1960s, these versions. But of course, time would move on, and other versions would come around. So let's move to our next set. I selected these as kind of modern representations because they're both 80s era. On the top, we have the Argentinian Paratrooper made by FMAP. And on the bottom, we have the Springfield SAR-3 made in Greece, who had a license. Like I said earlier, these were made in about 18 nations each, give or take. And very similar numbers. You had around 8 million, give or take, G3 types plus CETMEs, and you had 7 million FAL types. I'm not sure if that counts the L1 or A1 or not, but large numbers of each. Although more nations adopted the FAL L1A1, 90, whereas 40 nations adopted some version of the CETME or G3. Still very large, but yeah. As time went on, of course, synthetics would come more and more into use. Pistol grips, handguards. I could spend a whole video on it. FN would make changes gradually over time, mainly throughout the 60s into maybe the early 70s. For HK, they would start off with the original G3. Now, originally, when these were adopted into service, the German government had the license, and so HK and Rheinmetall would make them. In 1967, HK would essentially purchase full rights to the line from the government, Rheinmetall would give up their production rights to focus on machine guns. And this is really when HK was able to expand the line. This is when we see the MP5 and the HK33, and we would see the G3A3 fixed stock version and G3A4, which this represents here. The A3 had a synthetic stock replacing the wood, and the A4, of course, has the now very famous two-position HK metal collapsing stock. Synthetic pistol grip, and here this one still has the A3 style slim polymer handguard with heat shield. Of course, there's the wide one as well. They also went to alloy magazines, just further save on weight and production costs. Considering how cheap these were to make and how light they are, they're actually very durable. Kind of like these mags. Just make sure you have a few extras because they can dent quite easily. The FAL, for the most part, stuck to using the metric pattern magazine, typically of steel. Sometimes they do it from alloy. It just depends. This, of course, has the standard now 4-position rotary sight, hooded front, the more modern style flash hider. Still has a 17 3/4 to basically 18-inch barrel. This is the HK style bayonet lug. You get the drift. Up here, it's a little more interesting. The FAL, of course, has a folding stock, not collapsing. Here's that large pistol grip with storage. This has the so-called Holland, so single aperture rear sight with protectors that can only be adjusted for windage. There's also a 2-position flip that is probably more commonly identified with paratroopers, but this one came with the Holland, so I left it on. This one has the Type 3 receiver without lightning cuts. They did this, of course, to save on machining. This is the polymer handguard. It was made with or without grooves for a bipod. So in the barrel. And this one has the low sights. Actually, the first were introduced with the West German, the Bundeswehr's Gewehr 1, G1. And of course it has the combination muzzle device. This doubled as a flash hider, bayonet mount, grenade launcher, and it's internally threaded for blank fire training. And it fits on standard threads. These were introduced in the 60s. Now the original 5000 FAL had a 21-inch barrel. The first paratroopers did as well. The second round of paratroopers had an 18-inch barrel, so same length as the G3 CETME essentially. But because of needs of the Belgian paratroopers, the 5063 went all the way down to nearly a 17-inch barrel. It's like 17.14 or something. So a little bit shorter. And that allowed just a much shorter overall length with our stocks collapsed in. When they're extended out like this, this gun is about 39.5 inches long. With the stock extended out on this one, of course, it is 40 inches. Well, 40.5 inches, so slightly longer than a CETME. But with them folded and collapsed, we really save some weight. And by weight, I mean length, sorry. Collapsed in, this is right at 33 inches long, so under 3 feet. And it doesn't protrude very far. Part of this has to still be sticking out for the recoil buffer and spring guide end. It's actually very quick to deploy. The FAL, on the other hand, a little slower to fold in. Deploying it out is quite quick, but you have a secondary latch under here, and then you have to push it down. That's just to keep it secure. Folding the stock with very little hanging off the back, plus the shorter barrel, gives us a folded length of just under 29.5 inches. So for a 7.62 NATO gun, this thing is tiny. Of course, there is the G3K, most always seen with the collapsing stock. It has a barrel about 12.5 inches, but that's a very specialized gun. Most of them were the G3A4 that had the standard 17.75 inch barrel. And the rest of the gun was the same. This is HK really taking advantage of the whole modular feature. You can switch between collapsing and fixed stock in a heartbeat. and so there's really no other differences in the guns themselves, just the stock. However, for the various paratroopers, especially the 5063 here, this is a dedicated gun. You can't really switch types. It's stuck the way it is. Neither system has a quick removable barrel. Especially on the G3 CETME type, it's pinned in like on an AK, so you have to drive out a pin. On the FAL, it's a little bit easier. It's screwed in, but you really can't just unscrew it at will. So you're pretty much going to have whatever barrel length you have. Furthermore, for this version, the paratroopers requested a folding handle like we saw on the L1A1, and the removal of the carry handle. Some simply don't have a cutout at all in the receiver. Others just have a little spacer here. Now, for the G3 type, the mechanical system's of course the same. We have our bolt group and our recoil spring attached to our stock. No big deal, mechanically the same. For the FAL though, it gets much more complicated because, well, our spring was in our stock. Now it has to be located in the receiver. So it's actually a double spring now, technically triple. And very much like that we saw in the FN-49 decades earlier. It does make for the pull being quite stiff and may impact reliability a little bit because the bolt has a very short travel. To work this out, we have a special top cover with a recoil guide in it, and the receiver itself has to be altered, and the nose here in the front, a little bit of a divot, to allow it to work. So a lot of specialized parts go into a FAL paratrooper, whereas on the G3 system, you can just slap a stock on. So as much as I think the paratrooper is cool, the modularity here for the HK system really does win out. Although, interestingly, Spain never took advantage of it for the CETME, at least for mass production. Not really sure why. So yeah, I just wanted to show these because they're just kind of neat, and they show the 80s production versions. This is really when we do see that the cost difference. It is cheaper to make a G3 CETME than it is an FAL L1A1. This is built with old world, kind of traditional technology, machined parts, fitted together, very precise. This is made with newer technology, stampings, weldings, even castings for some elements later on. And it's, you know, a lot cheaper. Just like the AKM is quite a bit cheaper than the AK-47. So cost, there and again, does kind of go to the G3. But money's not everything. This to me just feels right. The ergonomics of the stock and grip, the larger grip on it, the placement of the safety, having an automatic last round hold open, the placement of the charging handle, even how easy the mags are to get in and out, it just feels right. It fits my body better. This is old world way of doing things with the machined parts. And even when it went from wood to polymer furniture, it didn't impact it much. The adjustable gas system really does let you dial it in. For a military, that could be a bit of a negative if your soldiers fiddle with it, but this thing doesn't rotate easily. Really, you need a tool. I mean, you can do it by hand maybe on some, but they have a tool for it, so it's not that big of a deal. Make sure at this plug it's plugged in properly and not on the off setting. So, yeah. The multi-device is quite neat. The lightweight bayonet. Going from the tall to the short sights made a lot of sense for oh so many reasons. And this is a little maybe harder to train a troop on. It's got a few more controls. Maybe disassembly is a little less intuitive. But once you get the hang of it, this is very end-user serviceable. Almost everything's held on with a screw or can be driven out with a punch. You don't need to do any welding, riveting on an FAL. It's again, very traditional. And I do like that headspace is set by just installing the right size locking shoulder. I think that's a very neat thing. And they are built to be very, very durable. I don't know. My instinct says that a FAL probably can run thousands of rounds more before needing major replacement or head spacing, versus a G3 before you need to replace a roller. The rollers or the bolt head, even the locking recesses in the trunnion, these can wear. So I have nothing to back that up, so I could be talking out of my rear. But I wanted to mention that these do seem to have longevity. But of course, both guns we've seen in service in various nations for decades. But you see some FALs that, my goodness, they went to work in the 50s and they still work today. So what about the negatives of each? The G3 is less expensive to produce and can be much more easily mass-produced in a factory. At least a factory set up with stamping and welding jigs and all that. So that might be a little expensive to get going, but once you do, the cost per gun quite low. The modularity we've talked about enough. It's plenty lightweight. Also, I should say that in a military gun, this has a cyclic rate of between 500 and 600 rounds per minute. The CETME was a little bit higher, and the FAL is actually quite a bit higher for those versions made with the full auto, anywhere from 600 to 700 rounds per minute. So I'd actually give, in a select fire gun, which none of these have been, I would actually give the edge to the G3 because a lower rate of fire is positive when you're using 7.62 NATO. On the other hand, this is a more violent direct force system, and it does tend to run dirtier, so they're both pretty difficult to control in automatic fire, frankly. But that said, the ergonomics are fine on this and can be customized, and it's very straightforward to train soldiers to operate and maintain. And it's quite easy to train unit armorers to replace rollers and all that. Also the sights, the 4-position, very easy to acquire. And of course later ones had a claw mount as a standard feature. So very good just to pick up and learn how to use. And they are known for very good reliability. This roller system with the fluted chamber will cycle pretty much anything. There's a few things it doesn't like, but yeah, it's pretty versatile, frankly. As for the FAL L1A1 is not highly customizable. Even removing the buttstock is a bit of pain in the neck because of the recoil spring in it. It's a lot more complicated than it should be. And then, of course, on top of that, you have all the different patterns, the metric, the inch. But even beyond that, there's the Israeli pattern and other kind of eccentricities. You just don't know. So, yeah, but the only thing that's super easy to change out are things like the handguards, muzzle device, but even then there are different thread pitches used. Heck, even the gas pistons and the gas plugs come in a few different lengths. So there is a learning curve there. And they can be magazine sensitive. If you have good mags, great, but if you get a bad mag, they can really wreck your day. And sometimes, especially if you're going to build one, it takes a bit to tune them in. Typically working with the gas piston, I've seen some that get a little bit bent, or the spring for the piston's a little weak. I've also seen the rat tail get bent once or twice. It can happen. Early versions had problems with their extractors and firing pins even, but that would be soon resolved. So it is a more refined machine. It's a more tuned machine, but that also means it could be a little more finicky. As far as the CETME G3, it's kind of the opposite. It can take just kind of being tossed in with any ammo and abuse, but that's also a downside. People today like to think of HK stuff as the pinnacle of manufacturing, and while it is very nice, this is definitely less of an old world feeling gun. You've got pins and welds. Sometimes they're cleaned up, sometimes they're not on the welds. The furniture is basic, utilitarian, but it works. As I said, the ergonomics for the safety is not great. Some complain about the hump back here if they wear glasses. And there's something about the way it shoots that's more jarring. I find the CETMEs to be a little gentler, but some of the HK types can really bump you around a bit. And again, when you go to disassemble them, the bolt head can be a bit of a tricky point. It just has a more Cold War mass-produced feel to it. Whereas the FAL just reminds me of something from a previous age, for whatever good or bad that might be. Of course, on the flip side, parts are very interchangeable with the CETME, so you can customize, and the G3, you can customize very, very easily. So, how do I feel? What's my opinion comparing the pros and cons to each? And which do I prefer? Maybe for folks who are new to the channel, hello, you may not know, but for those who've been around a minute, you know what I'm going to say. But first, let's end with these. This is the same SAR 3, now with the standard A3 stock on it. Again, that's one of the benefits of the modular system. Same thing goes with the lower group, of course, the handguard, even a bipod for the handguard. By the way, when they went to the modern style with the synthetic furniture, the weight would drop a bit to under 9.5 pounds. However, if you put on the collapsing stock, because it's essentially all steel, the weight goes all the way up to 10 pounds, making it technically the heaviest one here. For the FAL Paratrooper, it really varies depending on which barrel length, and if you have an alloy or steel lower, cast or stamped lower, forged. It's hard to say. Anywhere from 8.5 to 9.5 pounds typically on the FAL Paratroopers. Here we actually have my Congo, just because I felt like bringing it out. This has the 18-inch barrel. You can tell it's quite a bit longer. Also does not have the cut for the bipod, nor do the handguards. It does have the short sights, standard, non-reciprocating, non-folding FAL handle, standard modern carry handle. This has the two-position, more traditional paratrooper rear sight. This is also what was on the latter Argentinian version, sometimes called the Type 4s. And here's our modern stock, complete with thick recoil pad and the hump on the back. I like the FAL furniture that has kind of this matte finish. Some of it is very glossy. I like the matte. And yeah, another semi-auto from FMAP here. And as you see, this version is slightly shorter, like half an inch shorter than our G3A3. This is about 40.5 inches. This is right under, right about 40 inches. So, what do I think? Pros and cons. You know I prefer the FAL, but that's not to say I hate on the CETME G3. Far from it. But there's a reason I have a few of these, and really only the two you have seen in this video, the CETME and this one. So, yeah, why? Final and kind of personal thoughts. I would say, growing up, I might have been a little more aware, at least kind of tangentially, of the G3 because of how famous it was getting in the late 80s and 90s. But I was introduced on a more personal level to shooting and building the FAL right as I went into college, you know, meeting Doc and doing all that. So I have a lot of fond memories of the FAL. It wouldn't be long before I picked up a roller gun, but unfortunately, like a lot of people in the late 90s, my initial thoughts were kind of tainted by the less than stellar Century builds and even some of the special weapons types. So that gave a lot of us kind of second thoughts. Whereas the FAL, yeah, Century made some butcher jobs of those too, but there were a lot more imports, and they were easier to homebrew. So I just had a better experience overall. From a historical standpoint, yes, they were both used in large numbers, but the CETME, there's really only a couple of types. The G3, there's more varieties, but really if we're focusing, it's mostly just the modularity. The original, the A3, the A4. Most nations just directly copied what HK was doing. The FAL, on the other hand, there's a ton of different styles. You know, different nations, even amongst the inch. The British, the Australians, the Canadians, there's differences. Plus, there's the L1A1, the C1, the C1A1, the C2, the L2, the LTA1, the C2A1. And then you get into all the metrics for the different nations that were using it. And then the Israeli pattern, the heavy barrel RG, the different paratroopers. On top of that, my timing was excellent. The parts kits were available, and pre-ban and immediate post-ban guns had not gone crazy in price. So it's not so much that I only want to own 2 roller guns, it's just that I haven't found many others that really do it for me, whereas with the FAL, there's always a new flavor to go with. It's just my taste though. Like I said, I like its ergonomics, but I would feel like a collection wasn't complete unless you had a couple of roller guns, because I do find the system fascinating. It's both simple and highly complicated. The roller system itself is direct, no gas, just, things. But to get the machining right for the trunnion, the rollers, that requires a lot of good math. Probably not something you're going to work out at home. The FAL, on the other hand, yeah, it's pretty straightforward. It's a bolt that locks into a recess, and it's hit by a piston. More moving parts, more traditional parts, but it's something you can probably fine-tune at home with the right springs or refurbishment of parts. So FAL versus G3, I've got to give it to the FAL. But it's not burning the G3 there. It's not disrespecting it. It has its moments and points, and they're both a lot of fun to shoot. They just shoot very differently. That's it's just kind of my thoughts. They're worth comparing because of how close they came into service together, and in a lot of ways how the failure of the whole G1 thing to work with West Germany resulted in the G3. Although, I'm being honest, I think the Bundeswehr was always angling for the G3 since the mid-50s. But historically, who knows? So what do you think? You can tell me I'm wrong, but if you do, tell me why. Tell me why the G3 is better, or the CETME is better, and why the FAL sucks. I'm down for that. I think it'll be a fun discussion. As I said at the beginning, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. That really helps. And if you'd really like to do a bit, check out the link over to the Patreon page. Hope everyone's having a good weekend as we wrap up April. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.